Okay. All right. Well, welcome everyone. It's Monday. Welcome to our Proudly Pro-Life Webcast. And our guest today is Sergeant Wayne Cockfield, U.S. Marine Corps retired. He is also the Vice President for Medical Ethics with the National Right to Life Committee, and we are so happy to have him with us today. If you have questions, please email them to info@sclife.org. Again, all questions can be emailed to info@sclife.org. And joining us today to kick off this interview is our Executive Director, Holly Gatling. And Holly, without further ado.
Good afternoon, and welcome again to our Proudly Pro-Life, SCCL Proudly Pro-Life web conference. And thank you, Sally, for your extraordinary technical assistance, without which we would not be on the air. Wayne, when I interview our guests, I like to give them an opportunity to sort of introduce themselves and, say how you got into the pro-life movement and how you got where you are now. And you definitely have a very, very interesting story. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
To me?
Yeah.
Okay. Actually, I've always been pro-life. I actually believe the way I got into the pro-life movement started off with a book I read when I was 13 years old called, now my mind just went blank. It was about the death camps, the theory and practice of hell. It was about the death camps in Germany. And that book just shocked me when I was 13. And I told God at the time, if they ever started killing Jews again, I wouldn't stand by and do nothing. I would always do whatever it took to help them. Well, little did I know when I was 13 years old that I was volunteering for the pro-life movement, because the way things turned out, this country started not only to kill unborn Jewish babies, but unborn Catholic babies, Baptist babies, Methodist babies, all babies. And that's when I remembered the promise that I made to God when I was 13, that I would never let this happen without doing something. Consequently, when I was 19 years old, I joined the Marine Corps, sense of adventure. The Vietnam War was going on. So I went to Vietnam. I was a combat person in Vietnam. I was a sergeant in the Marine Corps. We were on river patrol, and we landed our rubber rafts, and a very large explosion went off right behind me. Literally blew me about 25 feet up in the air. I came down, sitting up, fell over backwards, couldn't move. I was extremely critically wounded. There was a small clearing by the river, just enough room for a Marine helicopter to get in, which is one of the main reasons I survived. The Marine helicopter got in literally within minutes of me being wounded. They threw me on the helicopter. The landing zone was so tight, the rotor blades on the chopper were knocking off limbs, and that's the truth. Chopper went up. I headed to the emergency combat center, where they started working on immediately, of course. Consequently, I spent 2 years and 3 months in the hospital. And while in the military hospitals, I had 27 operations. So after 2 years and 3 months, I got out. But subsequently, my total operational scorecard right now, I've had 35 operations during my lifetime. So when people want to talk about pain and suffering, I understand pain and suffering probably at least as well as anyone else. So
Absolutely.
Go ahead. What, Holly?
No, I was just saying, absolutely.
Right. And after I got out of the hospital, I moved to Columbia, a few years later. And I was going to the University of South Carolina, and I saw a little ad in the paper saying Columbia Citizens for Life meeting this whatever night it was. I don't remember the night. So I went to it, and there were, a few people there, 15 or 20 people, and that's how I got into the pro-life movement. When I started off, I never expected to go past the local level, but I became a speaker very quickly. And I was a speaker against abortion in those days. And this is before euthanasia really got going. But I would tell people that if we start killing babies at the beginning of life, the day's coming, we're going to be killing grandma and granddad at the end of life. People thought I was crazy, but they don't think that anymore.
No, absolutely not. And so you and I actually attended an anti-euthanasia workshop with the National Right to Life Committee, and that's how you were introduced to National Right to Life, and National Right to Life was introduced to you.
Yep.
And fast forward, where this is going is Wayne actually ended up as a non-governmental organization representative, an NGO, to the United Nations. So, Wayne, can you pick up there and tell us about your work? You were at the UN, for 4 years, and working on the Treaty on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities.
Right.
And if you mention, maybe just briefly, or however long you want to talk about it, why we actually have to be at the United Nations. It's very controversial. People hate it. You always see these signs on rural roads, get us out of the UN. But anyway, we have to be there, and you have firsthand experience as to why.
Well, what people don't understand about the United Nations is the United Nations makes international law. And the United States has, to my knowledge, I don't believe we signed any of the treaties that the UN has made. Now, by the way, they aren't called treaties at the UN; they're called conventions. So it was not the Treaty on the Rights of People with Disabilities; it was the convention. But the purpose of the pro-life movement at the UN, and it's not just National Right to Life. We have been at the UN since, I believe, the mid-'80s. And Jean Head is our Vice President for International Relations at the UN. And she is a well-known expert on the life issue at the UN. But our purpose at the UN is not only to try to get life-saving language into conventions, well, I'm just going to call them treaties. That's what they're known by in the United States. But not only to get life-saving language into the treaties, but to keep out pro-death language out of treaties, because the UN is a never-ending, constant push to make abortion and euthanasia an international human right. Now, if we as in the United States, if we don't sign a treaty that would push euthanasia and abortion, if the United States doesn't sign it, why is it important? Because you have a concept called customary international law. Every nation state that ratifies a UN convention strengthens the customary international law. Now, people don't realize that an international UN treaty supersedes national law, which is why the United States has not signed the Disabilities Treaty, which is a good thing, because our protection of disability rights goes far beyond what the UN treaty was and is. But if we would sign the Disability Treaty, it would supersede our own national laws.
Our law is called the Americans with Disabilities Act, right?
Yeah, the ADA. And
yeah.
Other countries, disabled people from other countries, their mouths drop open when they hear of how powerful the American with Disabilities Act is. Now, I was involved at the UN, and it was an experience. And the UN has a lot of bad things. But you know what? A lot of governmental and international governmental organizations have bad parts to them, but that doesn't mean you ignore it, because you will ignore international law to your own peril. And we have to be there, we need to be there, and we are there. And that was the best job I ever had.
Yeah, and so from there, we experienced, no, well, I guess it was, what was it, 2004, maybe while you were there, we experienced the death of Terry Schiavo. And the way you have described it is the first fully litigated torture killing of a disabled American citizen.
Terry Schiavo was the first fully litigated, court-mandated torture killing of an American citizen because they were disabled. Terry Schiavo, and most people, including you and Sally in the pro-life movement, knows her brother, Bobby Schindler, and her, and we did know her late father, but she was not unconscious. She was not brain dead. She was not dying. She was mentally disabled for reasons that are still not completely known. There's a lot of suspicion, but they're not known. She was killed because the court system would not give her a chance to live. It was a sad thing. It was vicious. It opened the gates, and we are now fighting. Let me tell you the difference between now and 15 years ago. 15 or so years ago, court cases were for the right to die. In today's world, in today's America, court cases are for the right to live. Doctor-prescribed suicide, which is being pushed all over this country, and euthanasia in general, is the final solution for devalued people. Let me make a point about euthanasia in general and doctor-prescribed suicide. Doctor-prescribed suicide is just a form of euthanasia. The one thing I always want people to understand when I make a speech or talk, people do not understand exactly what euthanasia is. They only read the dominant news media, many of them. The key to euthanasia, it is not for dying people. That is the key. Terry Schiavo wasn't dying. Most of the people being killed in the hospitals through starvation or through terminal sedation, which is overdosing on drugs, deliberate overdosing of the patient by the doctor on drugs. It's for people who will not die. If you're dying, you do not need euthanasia. Euthanasia is for those that will not die. Now, doctor-prescribed suicide, it's pushed toward devalued people, the elderly, the chronically ill, the disabled. I have a note right here. I got a few notes sitting by my computer. North Carolina law that was passed just a few years ago of doctor-prescribed suicide. The law was State Law 1046 in North Carolina. It mandates doctors follow advanced directives that choose death. It does not mandate that doctors follow advanced directives that choose life. So a doctor is legally required to follow a choice of death, but he's not legally required to follow a choice that someone makes to live. And why? Because this, you have fetal care. This whole issue of euthanasia goes real deep, and we could literally talk 3 or 4 hours without slowing down here.
Before you go on, explain the words advanced directives. What do those words mean?
It's like the South Carolina living will. by law in South Carolina, if you go to the hospital or a medical facility, they have to offer you what is called the South Carolina living will. It's very dangerous, and I would advise anybody who has signed a South Carolina mandated living will to tear it up. And if their doctor has a copy, to tear that up. It's very important to know you're not required to sign this. The medical people are required to offer it to you, which is a different thing. But I wrote a brochure. I wish I had it with me. I wrote a brochure for South Carolina Citizens for Life, and it was called The Living Will, Deceptive, Dishonest, and Dangerous, because the language is very ambiguous. When it says things like, if I am in a terminal condition and am expected to die in a reasonable amount of time. You see, nothing is really pinned down here. What's a reasonable amount of time? When you talk about things like terminal condition, we're into definitions, and modern people have no clue how definitions have changed. Terminal condition used to mean that you would die with treatment. The modern definition of terminal condition means you will die without treatment. So under this definition, people with diabetes, maybe, heart trouble, if they don't take their medicine, they'll die. Legally, they're classified as terminal. I have something right here that, this is from the Veterans Administration Hospital. I wish I could, you see the part that I have in red? Let me give you their definition of terminal very quickly. And this is the official Veterans Administration Hospital definition of terminal illness. Terminal illness, as defined herein, includes, here's the key word, but it's not limited to, conditions where death is imminent. So see, it's not limited to people who are dying, the definition of terminal. It is not limited to where death is imminent, as well as chronic and debilitating conditions from which there is no reasonable hope of recovery. What's a chronic and debilitating condition? I'm in a wheelchair. I have a chronic and debilitating condition of which there is no reasonable hope of recovery. Why is that important? Legally, at the Veterans Administration Hospital, I'm characterized as terminally ill. What does that mean? Food and water can be withheld. Another shock to many people, they don't realize that court cases have now pretty much concluded that food and water is a medical treatment. So if you have treatment withdrawn, you can have food and water withdrawn. That's what happened to Terry Chavo down in Florida. She didn't die, she was killed. She was killed by torture. She was killed by thirst. Her water was withdrawn, and she was literally, legally thirsted to death. It was a horrible thing.
For 13 days, correct?
Right. It took her, I believe, 13 days to die. Well, on the South Carolina Living Will, there's a box you can sign that says, if I'm considered terminal, and remember the modern definition of terminal, I would like artificial nutrition and artificial hydration to be withdrawn. If someone checks that box, they have just ordered, not asked, ordered the medical doctor to thirst and starve themselves to death. You'd be surprised the amount of people that do not understand artificial nutrition and hydration means food and water. See, I like to call it, it's not artificial. I like to call it assisted drinking, not artificial hydration. Water's water. It's assisted drinking. If I don't have the ability, if I'm sick and I don't have the ability to hold a glass up to my mouth, then all of a sudden my water becomes artificial hydration. That's very dangerous to devalue people.
Now, you touched on something that is very important to the pro-life movement, and it's the politics of language. So the pro-death side of this wants to make it sound like it's just something horrible, artificial nutrition and hydration, whereas we call it assisted feeding, assisted drinking. And I believe you're the one who kind of coined this phrase, the politics of language. And so talk about that battle that we have in the pro-life movement with the politics of language. I mean, one of the things that most pro-life people understand is we don't say pro-choice because that sounds like something good. We say exactly what it is: pro-abortion, pro-killing unborn babies. Mm-hmm. So talk about that on the issue of euthanasia, how we have to reframe the language.
Right. You shape the conversation with the politics of language. If the other side gets the pro-lifer to agree to their language, the pro-lifer has lost half the battle. Let me give you an example. I'm sure everybody who might ever see this, they've heard the term death with dignity. You hear it. It's in all the doctor-prescribed suicide laws that's being advanced across this nation. People have the right to death with dignity. But let me tell you, death with dignity is a slur to disabled people. What does death with dignity mean? It means you're living a life with no dignity, but you can get your dignity. But how do you get your dignity? You get your dignity by dying, and dying in a socially approved way. Now, there's another thing you'll see: end-of-life care. End-of-life care. What is end-of-life care? I call it ending a life care. When a medical doctor withholds wanted, life-saving medical treatment, he's not giving end-of-life care. He's giving ending a life care. He's killing that patient. Another term you'll hear, the dying process. Well, what's the dying process? What even does that mean? You know, I've heard it argued that the minute you're born, you're dying. You're in the dying process. All of these are terms that push somebody to one side. When a doctor talks to a family and says, well, you know, your patient is in the dying process. Well, the family can think the patient is dying. That's not what that means. That means he needs to be helped along. He needs ending a life care so he can have death with dignity. These are words straight out of George Orwell's 1984. These are very and people need to understand how dangerous these words are. It's like I used the politics of language one time at the UN when the EU was trying to put in, trying to keep out our life-saving language. And I was making a speech at the UN, and I said that if you do not put life-saving language into this treaty, all the United Nations will be doing is building a ramp to the gas chamber. That soundbite went all over the world. I've actually got on my computer that soundbite in about 15 different languages. It literally went all over the world.
Yeah, you were actually a member of the Disabilities Caucus, and you were kicked out of the Disabilities Caucus. I mean, you've been in a wheelchair since you were 20 years old, and you were kicked out of the Disabilities Caucus, and because that's how...
By the European Union.
By the European Union, absolutely. Now, we've got just about 3 minutes left, so would you please talk about how people can protect themselves? Let's talk about the Will to Live, which is an advance directive that is promoted by National Right to Life, South Carolina Citizens for Life. And this is a way that you can protect yourself from being killed against your will in the culture in which we live. So talk about that, and then we'll tell our audience how they can get a copy and how we can help them fill it out.
Right. The pro-life will to live is available in every state, and it's written to it's unique to every state. It's written according to every state's own laws. Now you can go to South Carolina Citizens for Life website and download a copy, or you can call South Carolina Citizens for Life office in Columbia if you want them to mail a copy. And we also have some suggested language you may or may not want to use, because you have to be very careful of the language you use when you fill out the will to live. You want to be specific. You don't want to use ambiguous terms like if I'm terminal. You got to be very precise. And we have a kind of a help sheet with language that you can use if you want to, but it's very helpful. I would strongly advise every single person to have a will to live, because it presumes for life. See, the South Carolina state mandated living will presumes for death, but the will to live presumes for life. You need this. Do not neglect this. This is the strongest advice I can give anyone. I have a copy. Holly has a copy. Most people in the pro-life movement have already filled out a will to live, and everyone needs to do that.
Absolutely. And we can send anyone a copy of Wayne's brochure, what's wrong with the South Carolina living will. It's dangerous, deceptive, and dishonest. We can send you a copy of that, and also a copy of the South Carolina will to live, which is a specific legal document. It is legal in South Carolina, and we can help anybody who needs help, who might be confused about exactly what something means, and we can help you fill it out and use your language that protects yourself. No one is forced to have any kind of treatment that he or she doesn't want. That's not the end game here. The end game is to protect you from being denied treatment that you want and need. Do you think that's a fair way to put it?
Right. With the fetal care policies, people are being denied in South Carolina, in most hospitals. I would almost assume every hospital, but I don't know every hospital. But in most hospitals, they're being denied wanted life-saving medical treatment because of their fetal care policies. And fetal care doesn't mean the treatment is futile. It means the person is futile. It's futile life unworthy of living. And now these people are being denied wanted life-saving treatment.
Well, Wayne, we have come to the end of our half an hour, which went by very rapidly. And Wayne is probably the most well-traveled speaker that we have in the South Carolina Citizens for Life office. He's spoken all over the country, and as I said, spent 4 years at the United Nations. And if you would like him to speak in your church or a social group, or any senior citizens, or just like a family group, no, you need to know how to deal with your parents and your grandparents, not just yourself, but how you help your parents and your grandparents. I know we're a little bit over. I just want to tell one quick little story about my mom. And when we were having this discussion, and she lived to be 101, and she was in her 70s at the time. And she thought that the attending physician was her personal physician. Now, my mother had a PhD. She was not dumb. But the language, most normal people would think of attending physician as personal physician. And she had no clue that this language in this terrible, horrible law that says attending physician it could mean Dr. Kevorkian if Dr. Kevorkian is standing by the hospital bed.
It just means the doctor who's standing beside you. That's in
Exactly.
the state mandated living will. It said if two doctors, one of which is my attending physician, that means only one doctor has to be present, and the one that's present is your attending physician. That you might not have a clue to who he is. You might be in another town and gotten in a wreck, and the doctor doesn't know you, and you don't know the doctor, but he's your attending physician. That's why the South Carolina will to live is deceptive.
Yeah, and so this is one of the aspects of the South Carolina Citizens for Life office that we are very, very engaged in. It's not like abortion where things are pretty black and white, cut and dry, but it is about protecting and saving vulnerable human life. So Wayne, thank you. We're going to have you back on again, and I'm sure that there are going to be people calling in wanting the will to live and your brochure about what's wrong with the living will. Okay, well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Sally.
Have a good time.
Thank you, Wayne. Thank you, Holly. And just so everyone knows, this is the brochure that Holly and Wayne were talking about. What's wrong with South Carolina's living will? Deceptive, dishonest, and dangerous. So we can send that out to you. Again, thank you, Wayne, for this wonderful interview. It's very informative, and it's a topic that not everybody hears about. It's a topic that not everyone is comfortable talking about. So with that, as in our previous interviews, today's interview has been recorded and will be made available on our website at sclife.org. If you are on our SCCL email tree, you will receive a copy of this video today, this broadcast, in your email. And it will also be posted to our Twitter and Instagram accounts as well. So in addition to being on Facebook, you can always come back to today's interview and share it with your friends and family on Facebook. This is a topic that needs to be discussed. So until next week, please stay safe, stay healthy, and thank you again for joining us. Bye-bye.